What would you do if you walked into your backyard and found your 6-year-old daughter floating face down in the water with no pulse? This is the story of a little girl who was dead for 17 minutes, and what she told her father when she woke up changed not just his life, but the lives of millions. David and Michelle Rodriguez lived in a quiet neighborhood in Tampa, Florida, the kind of street where kids ride bikes until sunset and neighbors wave from their driveways. David was a high school history teacher and Michelle was a pediatric nurse. They had one daughter, Sophia, a 6-year-old with curly brown hair and an imagination bigger than the Florida sky. Sophia loved to draw. She drew everything: animals, flowers, her parents, imaginary kingdoms with castles and rivers and people flying through the clouds. Every surface in the Rodriguez home was covered with her artwork. The refrigerator, the hallway walls, the bathroom mirror, all of it decorated with crayon masterpieces held up by tape and magnets and a father's pride. Saturday, September 14th, started like every other weekend. Michelle made pancakes. David put on music. Sophia sat at the kitchen table drawing a picture of a butterfly with wings made of rainbows. After breakfast, David suggested they spend the afternoon by the pool. It was one of those perfect Florida days where the sun sits high and warm and the air smells like jasmine and cut grass. Sophia splashed and laughed while David grilled burgers on the patio. Michelle went inside to answer a phone call. David stepped into the garage for 30 seconds to grab a bag of charcoal. 30 seconds. That is all it took. When he came back, Sophia was floating face down in the still water. The pool was silent. The whole world was silent. David screamed his daughter's name and dove in. He pulled her out and laid her on the warm concrete. Her lips were blue. Her chest was not moving. There was no pulse. He started CPR immediately, while Michelle ran out and called 911. He pushed on his little girl's chest and breathed into her lungs and begged God with every compression to bring her back. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. By then, Sophia had been without oxygen for 17 minutes. 17 minutes of silence. 17 minutes of a father's hands trying to restart a heart that had stopped beating. The lead paramedic looked at his partner and said quietly, "We're going to need a miracle." They loaded Sophia into the ambulance, and David climbed in beside her, holding her small, cold hand and praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. He did not know that the miracle had already begun. He did not know that in those 17 minutes of silence, Sophia had been somewhere else entirely. How long can 17 minutes feel when you are watching your child die? David would tell you it felt like 17 years. The ambulance screamed through the streets of Tampa, and every red light felt like an eternity. The paramedics worked on Sophia the entire ride, pushing fluids, monitoring her flatline, doing everything medical science could do for a body that had been without oxygen for too long. They arrived at Tampa General Hospital, and Sophia was rushed into the pediatric intensive care unit. The doctors moved fast. They intubated her, connected her to a ventilator, ran a battery of tests. Then the neurologist came out to the waiting room where David and Michelle sat holding each other like two people on a raft in the middle of an ocean. Dr. Patel was direct. 17 minutes without oxygen almost certainly meant severe and irreversible brain damage. Even if Sophia survived, she might never walk again. She might never speak again. She might never recognize her own parents. The scans would tell them more, but they should prepare themselves for the worst. Michelle collapsed into David's chest. David stared at the wall and felt something inside him crack. He was not an overly religious man. He went to church most Sundays. He said grace before meals. He believed in God the way most Americans believe in God, sincerely, but from a comfortable distance. But sitting in that waiting room with the ventilator's rhythm echoing down the hall, comfortable distance was no longer an option. He needed God to be close, closer than he had ever needed anything. He called their pastor, Daniel, and within an hour, the waiting room was full. Church members arrived with food and blankets and prayers. Pastor Daniel organized a 24-hour prayer chain. Every hour, someone from the congregation was praying specifically for Sophia. Her hospital room door became covered with cards and drawings from children in her Sunday school class. Handmade pictures of angels and rainbows and the words, "We love you, Sophia," written in wobbly crayon letters. Day 1 passed. No change. Day 2 passed. The scans showed minimal brain activity. The doctors grew quieter with each visit. On the night of the second day, David sat alone beside Sophia's bed at 3 in the morning. Michelle had finally fallen asleep on the waiting room couch. The monitors beeped steadily. The ventilator hissed and sighed. David held his daughter's hand, so impossibly small in his, and whispered the words of Psalm 23. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." He had said those words 100 times in his life, but he had never meant them until now. What if a child who had been dead for 17 minutes woke up and told you she had met someone you lost years ago? It happened at 4:17 in the morning on the third day. David was asleep in the chair beside Sophia's bed, his hands still wrapped around hers. He was dreaming about her laughing in the backyard when he felt her fingers move. Not a twitch, not a reflex, a deliberate, gentle squeeze. His eyes flew open. Sophia's eyes were open too, clear and calm and looking directly at him, with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not confusion. It was not fear. It was peace. The kind of deep, settled peace that does not belong on the face of a 6-year-old who has been in a coma for 3 days. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was soft, but steady. David could not breathe. He hit the call button, and within minutes the room was full of doctors and nurses. They ran tests. They checked vitals. They shone lights in her eyes and asked her questions. Sophia answered everything correctly. She knew her name, her birthday, her address. She knew the president's name and her teacher's name and what day of the week it was. Dr. Patel ordered an emergency brain scan. When the results came back, he stood in the doorway looking at the images as if they were written in a language he had never seen before. There was no damage. None. No swelling, no dead tissue, no signs of oxygen deprivation at all. A brain that had been without oxygen for 17 minutes showed zero evidence of trauma. "I cannot explain this," Dr. Patel said. "This does not happen." But it was what Sophia said next that shattered David's world completely. After the doctors left, Sophia tugged on her father's sleeve and said, "Daddy, I met your daddy while I was sleeping." David's blood went cold. His father, Roberto Rodriguez, had died of a heart attack 5 years before Sophia was born. There were no photos of him in the house. Michelle and David had agreed to wait until Sophia was older to talk about the grandfather she would never meet. Sophia had never seen his face. He was tall, Sophia continued. He had a big smile and a mark right here. She pointed to the left side of her jaw. David's father had a distinctive scar on his left jaw from a childhood accident. "He told me to tell you something, Daddy. He said to look in the blue box. He said there is a letter inside that you need to read." David stared at his daughter. His hands were shaking. Michelle stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. No one in that room could explain what was happening, but something far beyond medicine was speaking through a 6-year-old girl who had been dead for 17 minutes. What if the dead could send you a message, and the proof was hidden in your own garage? David drove home from the hospital that afternoon in a daze. Michelle stayed with Sophia, who was sitting up in bed chatting with nurses, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. David's mind was racing. The blue box. His father had been a mechanic his entire life, and he kept his most important tools in a blue metal toolbox. When Roberto died, David had taken the toolbox along with a few other belongings and stored them in the back of his garage. He had not opened that box in over 11 years. He pulled into the driveway and went straight to the garage. It took him 20 minutes of moving boxes and old furniture to find it, shoved into a corner behind a stack of Christmas decorations and covered in dust. The blue toolbox. He knelt on the concrete floor and opened the latches. Inside were his father's wrenches and screwdrivers, a pair of worn work gloves, and a small flashlight that no longer worked. David lifted the top tray and looked into the deeper compartment below. There, beneath a layer of old rags, was a sealed white envelope. It was yellowed with age, and the edges were soft. On the front, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, it said simply, "For David." His hands were trembling so badly he could barely tear it open. The letter inside was written on lined paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting was his father's, the same careful block letters Roberto had used his whole life. "My dear son David, I am writing this because I do not have much time left. The doctors told me yesterday, and I have made my peace with it. But before I go, there is something I need to tell you that I never had the courage to say out loud. 3 weeks ago, I had a dream. I know how that sounds. Your old man talking about dreams. But David, this was not an ordinary dream. I saw Jesus. He stood in front of me, and he was more real than anything I have ever seen in my life. He told me not to be afraid. He told me that my family would be taken care of. He told me that one day, when you needed it most, you would find this letter. I spent my whole life saying I believed in God, but I never really knew him. In that dream, I finally met him. And David, he is real. More real than this pen in my hand. More real than the air I am breathing. Whatever happens to you in life, whatever storm comes, hold on to him. He will never let go of your family. I love you more than words, Dad." The letter was dated October 11th. Roberto died on October 12th. He had written it the day before he passed. David sat on the cold garage floor holding his father's last words against his chest and wept. His father, the quiet mechanic who never talked about feelings, who went to church only on Christmas and Easter, had met Jesus in a dream and written this letter, knowing that somehow, someday, his son would need to find it. And a 6-year-old girl who had never met her grandfather delivered the message. What happens when a child picks up a crayon and draws something that should be impossible for any human being to create? Sophia came home from the hospital on a Tuesday. The doctors had no medical explanation for her recovery. They used words like unprecedented and anomalous and scheduled. Follow-up appointments that they themselves admitted were more out of curiosity than necessity. For the first 2 days, Sophia was her normal self, playing with her dolls, watching cartoons, and asking for mac and cheese at every meal. Then on Thursday morning, she sat down at the kitchen table, picked up her box of crayons, and began to draw. What came out of that child's hands over the next several hours was something David and Michelle could not comprehend. Sophia had always been a good little artist for her age, drawing the kind of bright, lopsided pictures that every 6-year-old draws. But what she was creating now was different, profoundly and impossibly different. She drew landscapes of rolling hills covered in flowers that seemed to glow with their own light. She drew a river that was somehow both blue and gold at the same time. She drew figures of people surrounded by radiance, their faces detailed and expressive in ways that no 6-year-old's motor skills should allow. And then she drew him, an older man with broad shoulders and a wide smile, and a small mark on his left jaw. He was standing in a field of light, with his hand extended downward, holding the hand of a little girl with curly brown hair. "That's your daddy, Daddy," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "He was really nice. He showed me around and told me he watches you every day." David picked up the drawing, and his knees buckled. It was his father. Not a vague resemblance. Not a lucky guess. It was Roberto Rodriguez, captured with a precision and warmth that photographs had never quite managed. The shape of his eyes, the way his smile pulled slightly higher on the right side, the thick forearms of a man who worked with his hands his whole life. Every detail was perfect. Michelle called Dr. Patel. He came to the house and studied the drawings in silence for nearly 30 minutes. Then he made a phone call. The next day, a pediatric neurologist named Dr. Rebecca Chen arrived from the University of South Florida. She spent 3 hours with Sophia, running cognitive tests and examining the artwork. When she finished, she sat down with David and Michelle and said, "I have studied the human brain for 22 years. A child who experienced 17 minutes of cerebral anoxia should not be able to hold a crayon, let alone create artwork at this level. What I am seeing in these drawings is not just unusual. It is, by every metric I have available to me, impossible." She paused. "I do not have an explanation, but I think your daughter does. What happens when science runs out of answers, and the only explanation left is the one that cannot be measured?" Dr. Rebecca Chen was not a woman who used the word impossible lightly. She held 2 advanced degrees, had published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on pediatric neurology, and had spent her entire career operating within the precise and provable framework of empirical science. She was also an atheist, not the aggressive kind, the quiet kind, the kind who respected people of faith, but simply could not find sufficient evidence to share it. When she returned to her office at the university that night, she spread Sophia's drawings across her desk and studied them under her lamp. She compared them to documented cases of acquired savant syndrome, a rare condition where brain trauma unlocks extraordinary abilities in art, music, or mathematics. But the comparisons fell apart almost immediately. Acquired savants typically develop narrow technical skills. They do not produce work that carries emotional and spiritual depth. They do not draw people they have never seen with photographic accuracy. And they certainly do not include details that correspond to verifiable facts about deceased individuals they have never been told about. Dr. Chen then cross-referenced Sophia's descriptions and imagery with over 300 documented near-death experiences from research databases around the world. The results unsettled her. Sophia's account of what she experienced matched the core elements reported by NDE survivors across completely different cultures, languages, and religions. The overwhelming light that was not blinding, the feeling of absolute love, the presence of deceased relatives, the sense of being shown things rather than imagining them. These were not details a 6-year-old in Tampa could have learned from television or Sunday school. They were specific, consistent, and deeply aligned with accounts from people who had no connection to each other or to Sophia's family. Dr. Chen presented her findings at a medical conference in Atlanta 3 weeks later. The room was packed. She put Sophia's drawings on the screen beside brain scans, showing 17 minutes of oxygen deprivation, and then showed the scans taken after she woke up, completely normal, and the room went silent. She concluded her presentation with words that shocked her colleagues. "I've spent my career believing that the brain is the sole source of human consciousness. I still believe science is the most powerful tool we have. But I am standing here today telling you that I examined a case that science cannot explain. I am not saying I know what the explanation is. I am saying that intellectual honesty requires me to admit there may be dimensions of human experience that our instruments are not yet equipped to measure." It was the first time in her career she had acknowledged the possibility of something beyond the material world. And it started with a 6-year-old girl and a box of crayons. What happens when one family's miracle becomes a message that reaches millions? The conference presentation was recorded and uploaded to a medical education website. Within 72 hours, it had been shared over 500,000 times. A producer from NBC Nightly News called David and Michelle, then CNN, then Good Morning America. The Rodriguez family sat on their living room couch with Sophia between them and told their story to the nation. Sophia held up her drawings for the camera with the casual confidence of a child who does not yet understand that what she experienced was extraordinary. To her, it was simply what happened. She went to sleep, She met her grandfather in a beautiful place. He told her some things to tell her daddy, and then she came back. The interview aired on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning it had been viewed over 12 million times. The response was overwhelming. Emails flooded in from every corner of the country, and then from around the world. A father in Michigan whose son was in a coma wrote to say that Sophia's story gave him the strength to keep praying for one more day. His son woke up the following week. A retired firefighter in Oregon who had not stepped inside a church in 30 years watched the interview and drove to the nearest Sunday service the next morning. A grieving mother in London who had lost her daughter to cancer wrote that Sophia's drawings of heaven were the first thing that brought her peace in 2 years. Doctors and scientists debated the case on medical forums and talk shows. Some dismissed it. Some were intrigued. But the people who were suffering did not need a scientific explanation. They needed hope. And Sophia's story gave it to them in a language that transcended academia and theology and went straight to the human heart. Through all of it, Sophia remained exactly who she had always been, a 6-year-old who liked mac and cheese and drawing and playing in the backyard. She did not understand the cameras or the attention. She just knew that she had met her grandfather, and that he was happy, and that the place she visited was filled with a love so big she could not find a crayon bright enough to draw it. David and Michelle watched their daughter color at the kitchen table one evening after the interviews were over and the cameras were gone. Michelle said quietly, "Do you think she will always remember what she saw?" David watched Sophia humming to herself as she drew a perfectly ordinary picture of a cat wearing a hat. "I think the point was never for her to remember," he said. "I think the point was for us to believe." What if the greatest legacy you could leave is not what you build, but what you give away in your weakest moment? 2 years passed. Sophia turned 8. She still loved drawing, but her pictures had returned to the bright, lopsided, wonderful creations of a normal child. The extraordinary detail that had stunned doctors and scientists gradually faded, like a window that had been briefly opened to another world, and then gently closed. She still remembered her grandfather. She still talked about the light and the flowers and the feeling of being completely loved. But the urgency of the message had been delivered. The letter had reached its destination. David and Michelle did not let the experience fade with it. 6 months after Sophia's recovery, they established the Sophia's Hope Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families with children in intensive care. They knew from their own experience that the waiting room is one of the loneliest places on earth, that the hours between test results feel like years, that the hospital cafeteria at midnight is where faith either deepens or disappears. The foundation provided practical support like meal deliveries, temporary housing for families who traveled for treatment, and financial assistance for medical bills. But it also provided something harder to measure: presence. Trained volunteers, many of them parents who had survived their own ICU vigils, sat with families during the darkest hours. They did not preach. They did not offer easy answers. They simply stayed. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone in crisis is to not leave. The foundation grew to serve 12 hospitals across Florida and then expanded to Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. Dr. Rebecca Chin joined the advisory board, not as a believer, but as a scientist who had learned that mystery and medicine are not enemies. She said in an interview, "I still do not have an explanation for what happened to Sophia Rodriguez, but I have seen the impact of her story on thousands of families. Whatever the source, the fruit is undeniably good." On a quiet Sunday afternoon in November, David and Michelle took Sophia to visit the pediatric wing of Tampa General, the same hospital where she had lain in a coma 2 years earlier. They walked through the halls delivering art supplies and handmade cards to children in their beds. In one room, a young mother sat alone beside her unconscious toddler. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. She looked the way David had looked on the worst night of his life. Sophia walked into the room without being asked. She set a drawing on the bedside table, a simple picture of a sun breaking through clouds with the words, "God is here," written in wobbly crayon letters. Then she took the mother's hand and said, "Don't be scared. He's going to be okay. God is watching him right now." The mother broke down in tears and pulled Sophia into a hug. David stood,